Time and Place by GingerBaggins, Chapter 2, Considerations. 6 years later, Hermione peeled her sweat-laden body from the sheets, setting her feet tentatively on the floorboards. She let her head fall into her palms and decided it would cause no further harm to let out a few silent tears. Crookshank was her only witness, and he had no one to tell. Though the nightmares changed shape, they always concluded the same way. Her sitting bolt upright, a gasp ripping from her throat, her hair stuck to her skin. Sometimes it was memories, whispers of horcruxes that hung around her neck, anxious nights watching over the tent, failed apparitions and flinching, her parents looking through her with no hint of recognition, giant snakes that lurked in pipes of the bodies of deceased authors, snatchers with grubby nails attached to wandering hands, Bellatrix's delight as she spat curses from above, her chest splitting open from an unspoken curse, heavy pressure of her chest as she waited for rescue at the bottom of the Black Lake. There were no two ways about it. Hermione had a roster of trauma to choose from. Sometimes it was imagined Greyback having his way with her after Bellatrix was done, Ronald leaving only never to return, her parents writhing on the floor of the Malfoy drawing room, Harry's body laying limp at the feet of Voldemort. She wasn't alone in her nightly terrors. Her friends suffered them too. Almost everyone did. Hermione had learned a lot over the last few years, but nothing more so than the lingering effects of war. She took a deep breath and cast a Patronus. Her otter bounced from the end of her wand and looked back at her expectantly. "Find Harry Potter and Ronald Weasley. Tell them I'm making coffee." It was only 6 a.m, but she knew they would be up. They always were. The war had begun for everyone else after the Department of Mysteries in the 5th year, but for the three of them it had begun when they were merely 11. They leaned on each other just as much now as they had back then, coffee being the unspoken confirmation that it had been indeed one of those nights. Hermione would love to say that she had moved on with her life as gracefully as her two dearest friends, but it would be a lie. Harry was the youngest head Auror in the Ministry history. He and Ginny had wasted no time getting married, and she knew it wouldn't be long before little Potters started sprouting. She was beyond thrilled for them. The sight of Harry's content smile warmed Hermione like nothing else. Ronald had taken longer, more indirect path to contentment, but he had found himself there nonetheless. After the brief whirlwind of their post-war romance, they both decided that they were better off as friends. It had broken both of their hearts to admit it, but they were not those same kids who ribbed each other between classes and argued about the Yule Ball. They were adults who were managing lingering PTSD and trying to figure out who they were when they weren't fighting Dark Lord and following Harry. What was supposed to be his first rebound turned out to be the woman he'd come to love, and Hermione adored her too. She and Ron would always love each other in one way or another, and she was beyond happy for him. Did it sometimes crush her to imagine how different it could have been? Of course. "Enough wallowing," she muttered, brushing aside the head rush that followed as she pushed herself off the bed. There were very few things in this life Hermione enjoyed more than coffee. Simple, elegant, muggle-made coffee. Her friends cared for it only so far as to hum with praise when sipping it, but to Hermione, it was as close to art as she could get. The boys appeared in her fireplace only 3 minutes apart, but she'd still beat them to the kitchen and pulled out 3 mugs and a plate full of semi-stale pastries from her last visit to the Burrow. "So have you solved your problem?" Harry asked into his cup, eyes flickering with intrigue, the way that they always did when he asked about her work that he knew she could not disclose the details of. "Unfortunately, I'll need to hire a potion master," she sighed, leaning back in her chair. Ron frowned and spoke through the pastry he was still chewing. "You were best in our year. Why can't you brew it?" I was best in our year at school, Ronald. I never pursued a mastery in potions. That requires someone with more precise skill. Who's on the list? Harry asked, a delighted smile tugging at his mouth when Hermione raised her eyebrows at him. Oh, come on. We know you have a list. I do, she mused, letting the feeling of being known spread through her like a warm hug. Roberto has already declined. I'm still waiting on a response from Celia. What about George? Ron asked. George didn't take his OWLs, let alone a mastery. No, but he brews potions all day. Do you know how badly it could go if he didn't know what he was doing? Hermione considered it for a moment. George certainly excelled in the outlandish, which is exactly what she was looking for. Roberto's rejection had called her project dangerously experimental. He'd opted for her offer to be obliterated from his memory before he'd even finished reviewing the papers. The short list of ministry-approved potion masters she had to choose from consisted of nobody under the age of 90, and it would be no shock at all to find out that neither of her other offers had been successful. Perhaps George's outside-of-the-box thinking was what she needed. However, he would need to take the project seriously, and he'd need to take time away from the shop, something she loathed to ask of him. It had only reopened in the last couple of years, and he was finally settling back into the life he'd so nearly abandoned in grief. Still, he might be her best option. Malfoy did his mastery in potions, Harry said, knocking her out of her reverie with the force of a sledgehammer. How nice of him, she muttered, turning her attention back to her coffee instead of his lingering gaze. He's very good. He brews the department's healing potions, never leaves a scar behind. Bloody good hangover relief, too, Ron nodded solemnly. She mused, enjoying the sharpness of the coffee. When she looked back up, both men were staring at her with expectation, and she could not stop the laugh that shot out of her for love nor money. You are being serious. He's already at the ministry, and he's qualified. Besides, everyone knows he wants to stop working as an Auror. And I'm supposed to be his ticket out, am I? No, Harry countered, far more measured than she. But it sounds like it could be mutually beneficial. It would be hellish. He's different, Hermione, he replied, voice low and soothing. I know it's hard to believe it, but we've seen enough proof of it over the years. Don't get us wrong, he's still a git, just not for the same reasons as before, Ron added. Ah, yes, Hermione knew all about their friendship with Draco Malfoy. It had taken them a long time to warm up to him, but he'd been relentless in his apologies, even going as far as to take a curse to the chest while covering Ronald on one of their more dangerous missions, after providing them with all the information they would need to carry it out in the first place. Both men had shed their lingering reservations about him, after all, though Hermione struggled to do the same. It was not their faces that he spat slurs into, after all. Even if he had changed, the memories of his treatment had not. You have more reasons to hate him than anyone, and I hope you know that we are with you in all things, but just think about it. Harry leaned over to pat the top of her hand. He wasn't lying. Despite their unexpected friendship with the young Malfoy, they had both always been ready to sever ties should Hermione only utter the request, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. After all, was this not the unity they had fought so hard to bring about? Malfoy had cut ties with his family over the last few years. He denounced his father's prejudiced views and opted to spend his probationary time in Azkaban, rather than alongside Lucius under home arrest. He'd gone to great lengths to make amends for his previous wrongdoings, including what her friends had deemed to be a Hogwarts apology tour. She'd never forget when that tour had stopped at her feet, there in Harry's kitchen, her hands pruning from soaping water. She'd not let him get the words out. She'd not want to hear it. She still didn't. In truth, Hermione had forgiven Draco Malfoy years ago. She'd have not testified at his trial otherwise, and she'd certainly have not convinced the two fools before her to hire him, nor would she have put up with his presence during game nights, and she certainly wouldn't be considering offering him the job of a lifetime. But she was considering it. They'd argue even more than she did with Ronald. They'd drive each other insane. She'd bite at him, and every time he smirked. Marlon forbid he try to joke with her. She'd tear off his head. She knew his views on blood purity had long since changed, but being in such close and sustained contact with a man who wished death upon her on so many occasions did not sound conducive to a successful working environment. And yet, she was still considering it. "Are you at the shop today?" she asked, turning to Ron. "For a bit, yeah. Can I join you? I'll speak to George first." "Sure, but if he gets to know what you're working on before I do, I'll kill him." George had become one of the people Hermione grew closest to after the war. He'd been the shell of his former self, and she'd felt equally as hollow. He'd lost the person he's considered the other half of himself, and it tainted everything: his work, his home, his reflection. Hermione had felt a kinship to his grief in a way, for she had lost everything too: her home, her parents, her sense of self. It was on each other's shoulders that they had wept, and in their tears found some semblance of relief. With all that being said, she knew what his answer would be before she'd even finished asking the question. "I'd love to," he trailed off with a grimace, stepping out from behind the shop's front desk. "But you can't." "But I can't. I know you think quite highly of me, but I'm not sure that my potions are going to be suitable." "You won't even hear my pitch?" "No, because it wouldn't take much to convince me to do it," he laughed, throwing an arm over her shoulder. "And I do love the idea of being an unspeakable, but I withdraw from this race." He turned to her. She was close enough to see the exhaustion beneath the joyful exterior. She wondered if it would ever go away. "I've only just found my feet again," he whispered, and she nodded quickly. "Yes, you have, so keep it steady." When she returned home that afternoon, she discovered her owl sat waiting with 2 letters, each of them polite but firm rejections from 2 remaining prospects. She threw herself into her father's old armchair and waved her wand thoughtlessly towards the fire, barely even noticing how the flames licked at her skin as they grew. A sense of dread formed as she realized Malfoy really was her last option. She found him at his desk the following morning. Reading glasses that she had been warned not to mention were sliding down his nose as he bent over his papers. She noted he was chewing gum, a revelation that shocked her more than it should have. Wizards didn't chew gum. Pureblood, Sacred 28 wizards certainly didn't chew gum. She gripped the brown paper bag tighter to her chest and marched over to him. "Thought you were scoping the Donner house today?" he asked flatly, not even looking up. "It wasn't on my schedule, no," she answered, equally monotone. His hat snapped up to her so quickly that she wondered if it hurt. His gray eyes as wide as saucers. He scrambled to remove his glasses, tucking them into the front pocket of his shirt as though the act would undo the fact that she had already seen them. She couldn't help it. The smirk formed on its own accord. "Short-sighted?" she asked. "Ironic, isn't it?" She blew out a quick chuckle, which only caused his eyes to widen more. God, the power she felt at that moment was undeniable. He was intimidated by her, and they both knew it. "Your idiots are out, I'm afraid." "Oh, that's all right," she replied, shrugging. "I'm not here for them. I'm here for you." She may as well have electrocuted him for the way he flinched, and when she held out the paper bag in offering, she was sure he was considering exactly how willing she'd be to poison him in broad daylight, right here in the center of wizarding law enforcement. "It's a cinnamon bun," she assured him, and he took the bag with confused tentativeness. "I haven't even spat on it." She pulled out a vacant chair and perched beside him. grabbing the bag, dispensing the buns where he'd not moved after a while. She slid one towards him and took a bite of her own, letting out an involuntary groan of satisfaction when the soft pastry hit her taste buds. It was truly delightful. Malfoy, however, looked like he was about to faint. "Why are you bringing me cinnamon buns?" he managed to ask, quiet as a mouse. "It's from Barry's across the street," she replied, looking between him and his bun expectantly. She was toying with him, and it wasn't a professional way to start what was intended to be a professional conversation, but she just couldn't stop herself. "Try it." He didn't protest a second time, slowly lifting the cinnamon bun to his lips and taking a small bite. His eyes closed briefly as he savored it, and a small feeling of victory settled in Hermione's stomach. "Fuck," he breathed, in a tone that she was not prepared for in the slightest. "I told you." "You haven't told me shit, Granger," he countered, taking another bite so that she had to watch him chew before he continued, distasteful. Surely Malfoy's were raised with better manners. "Why are you here?" "Where did you achieve your mastery?" she asked, deciding to turn her focus to business and not his salacious attack on the cinnamon bun. "At home," he answered quickly, brows pulling together. "Why?" "You were privately educated in potions mastery?" "Yes. Not a great deal of institutions were willing to house an ex-Death Eater." He shrugged, and it should have filled her with horror to hear him say those words, but it only seemed to fill her with rage. He'd been refused standard education because of a choice his father made for him when he was 16. What was the point of the acquittal if not to acquit him? "That must have been expensive," is what she opted for. "Though I suppose money's no object." "You're mistaken," he spoke, and his tongue darted out to collect the sprinkling of icing that had gotten caught on his lip. Hermione didn't notice, and if she did, she thought nothing of it. Nothing at all. "I have not had access to Malfoy Vault for a while now." "Right, of course. He'd disowned himself. If he was bothered by it, he did a remarkable job of appearing as though he wasn't." "Do you still brew?" she asked, fingers merely picking at the remainder of her bun. "As often as I can." His eyes narrowed on her as though he were trying to solve a puzzle. He made her feel itchy. "Why are you really here, Granger?" "Work?" "Surely you can wait until Potter and Weasley return to ask them." "Not your work, my work." "Oh." He breathed, eyes open again. Her department was no secret, though everything within it certainly was. People had tried various tactics over the years to get her to spill the details of her job, including lacing her wine with Veritaserum. Harry and Ron knew more than they should, but no one knew it all. Only herself and Kingsley Shacklebolt, though even he was unaware of finer details. "I need a potions master to work with me on a project. It's currently theoretical, potentially dangerous, extremely experimental, and will likely take a significant amount of time to complete." She began, sitting straight in her chair, watching as Malfoy mirrored her movements. "If you're interested in hearing more, I'm happy to tell you, though there are conditions." She expected him to argue, but he only gestured for her to continue. "The first is that, should you refuse the offer, I will need to obliviate the entire conversation from your memory, which I would rather not do, trust me, but it is policy." "That's understandable," he nodded eagerly. "The second is, should you agree to work on this project, I will require an unbreakable vow to ensure secrecy. Not a soul can know about this. Without approval from Kingsley, the vow will be made before I can even explain anything, considering your current legal standing, and I will need to speak with Kingsley first." "You can't tell me what it is before I agree to do it?" "You are not currently a ministry-approved potions master, so no." He considered it for a minute, his eyes darting down to the pile of paperwork that were stacked neatly on his overly organized desk, before returning to lock onto her words with startling intensity. Yes. She faltered, blinking rapidly at him as she scrambled for mental purchase. Just like that? Granger, I am grateful for this job, but I don't want to be here much longer. You are offering me an opportunity to become an unspeakable and brew a secret experimental potion. Of course my answer is yes. You would be working directly with me, no one else, she almost shouted, nerves getting the better of her. She'd expected him to take some time to think about it, to consider the implications of their working arrangement. She'd half expected him to shut the idea down completely. Not this. Will that be an issue for you? He asked her, and his voice was suddenly filled with such genuine concern that she wasn't sure if she wanted to squeeze his hand or knock out his teeth. I'm a big girl. Will it be a problem for you? She countered, raising a challenging eyebrow. Not at all, he replied, without a moment's hesitation. What planet has she found herself on? It surely was not her own. Tell me where to be and when to be there. As easy as that. Now all she had to do was convince the Minister of Magic that an ex-Death Eater would make a mighty fine unspeakable. All right, she said, straightening the collar of her shirt. I'll be in touch. She noticed how his gaze had dropped from hers and now lingered with a plain sense of longing and her half-eaten cinnamon bun. They really were delicious, he whispered, and her eyes nearly rolled back into her skull. Still spoiled, she hissed, pushing the bun towards him and taking her leave. The last thing she heard as she stepped out of the office was the small sound of a delighted laugh, and it occurred to her that she'd not thought him capable of producing such sound. And that's the end of chapter 2.